As we fluency grew.
The thing that's different about a burger.
All right. Good morning and welcome back. I hope you had a good weekend. Yes, there is a pretty weird smell that's coming out of the Ackerman building. They have located that it's coming from the storage pipes in the basement. So they are in the process of airing everything out of the building. That's why the doors are wide open as you're coming in. So if you're having trouble with the smell and all of that stuff, or it's kind of weird, no, it is not Team Spirit. It's the basement and the pipes and all that. So hopefully that will be resolved pretty soon here. I got the email this morning that there was a weird smell and all of that stuff. And I'm like, gosh, Mondays, right? So welcome back. Glad to have you here. Let's get rolling. So we have another practice question. This connects to what we talked about on Friday. So locus of control and emotional intelligence are examples of what? Cognitive dispositions, attachment styles, communication dispositions, or socio-communicative dispositions. Take a moment to think about this question and we'll talk about it together. Anybody who would like some additional time on this question? What is a locus of control? Or what is an example of locus of control?
It's something that has a lot of bearing to it, right? Like it's,
Yeah.
I
It's all right. So thanks, Zeke. You're getting us on the right track. So it's Monday. We're getting back into everything. Locus of control is a feeling of being in control of your own life and decisions. So if you have an internal locus of control, you say, you know what, if I study, I'm going to do well on this test, right? Locus of control means I have the power to change my life and to make decisions. An external locus of control would be saying, no matter what I do, I'm going to get a C on this test, no matter how hard I try. It's not up to you. It's an outside factor that's going to make the decision. What is emotional intelligence? Yeah. So it connects to that, yeah. So emotional intelligence, right, is about your ability to understand and make sense of your own emotion. I understand that I'm feeling stressed because I have an exam this week, right? But also to understand the emotions of other people. An example of having good emotional intelligence would be noticing that somebody seems a little bit stressed out while you're talking to them, and you're telling a story about your weekend and saying, oh, hey, is everything okay, right? You're stopping the conversation and adjusting your communication based on your read of the other person's emotion. So these two things are examples of what so many people think this is A, cognitive dispositions, B, attachment styles, C, communication dispositions, or D, socio-communicative dispositions. So yes, the answer is A, cognitive dispositions, right? When you're thinking about the word cognitive, the really easy way to remember it is to think about cog, right? And think about cogs turning almost like a watch in your brain, right? The cogs turning in your brain refer to cognitive, right? What's going on in your head. So your feeling of control over your own life or your ability to understand your emotions, right, would be examples of cognitive because they're about how we process and mentally understand experiences with other people. Attachment styles, right? These are secure, preoccupied, fearful, and dismissing. They are how we connect to other people. Communication dispositions and socio-communicative dispositions relate to things such as introversion or extroversion in communication. They're how we choose to communicate with other people. Socio-communicative are about choices that we make in our communication, such as being Machiavellian or seeing other people as pawns, right? So these are different ways that we choose to communicate and relate to other people. Again, a good example of a practice question. I do want to direct you to a couple resources and just things to know as we gear up at this point in the term. The Canvas page for this course and its schedule have a couple resources to help you out. A couple of you requested that the correct answers to the writing activity that we did be posted, and I posted those so that you can refer back to those. And then the group activity that laid out the 5 different parts of communication. I compiled some of the things that your group worked on together, and I figured being able to identify those 5 might be a useful thing for you to refer back to. Also, this winter, I'm going to be teaching small group communication. So if that group and category is interesting to you, we'll be getting into more of that detail later. I do want to direct you to the Canvas prompts. So if you haven't completed any Canvas prompts yet, remember that you will need to complete these next 6, since you'll need to complete 6 out of 8. This third Canvas prompt is asking you to look at verbal and nonverbal communication. It's got a fun little clip from the movie WALL-E as an example of nonverbal communication. Also, I have graded the week 2 Canvas prompts for those of you that turned that in. Across the board, some really good work here. The big thing that I noticed in a lot of submissions is to break up sentences with commas, right? When you have different clauses or parts of a sentence, you want to use commas to split that up a bit. So if you say in a sentence, for example, when I went to the store, right? After, for example, you should be including a comma. So just work on eliminating those run-on sentences and just reviewing those. Oftentimes you can break up those larger sentences to help things flow a bit more smoothly. So just wanted to point out, noticing that. You'll also notice, right? We have this week talking about verbal and nonverbal communication. We'll have next week focusing on culture. We do have the midterm on week 5. So that midterm window starts on Wednesday, October 26th. That is 2 weeks from Wednesday. So what I'll be doing on Wednesday is posting a study guide that goes over the terms and concepts that I'm asking you to be familiar with, many of which we've already gone over, some of which we'll be discussing over this week and next week in a bit more detail. But I like to provide that at least 2 weeks in advance to help you to go over and prepare. What this means, right, is that we do not meet on Wednesday or Friday that week. Since it's a take-home midterm, you can complete it. You have 2 hours to complete it anytime, anywhere that works best for you. It's open note and open book. So I will post that study guide on Wednesday, go over that in a bit more detail. Just have that on your radar that that's coming up for that. Any questions about anything that we talked about last class? Anything about the course in general before we get started today? Again, these were the cognitive dispositions that we went over last class and ways that we can express ourselves mentally. We also talked about personality and temperament and dispositions in communication. Also, as a reminder, right, make sure that if you're present, that you do have your name on and are completing the attendance activities, whether they're in a group or on your own. That's just how I keep track of attendance. So most of you have been doing a great job of that, so just make sure to continue doing so. So for today, we are looking at both verbal and nonverbal communication. Today, we'll be focusing on verbal, and we'll start to compare them with nonverbal as we go forward. So verbal communication is something that I think we know or understand, but breaking it down and understanding what defines verbal communication is really important here. In particular, right, verbal communication involves the use of language. So we'll be talking about how language shapes the ways that we communicate across a variety of different cultures and contexts, right? This idea that communication shapes our reality, how we think and how we just like mentally process information is through communication. So we'll be looking at some of the ways that that shapes our relationships. What I'd like you to do to start things out for today is to take the time to chat with somebody in the class. Perhaps take the chance to meet somebody that you haven't worked with before in an activity or assignment. And take a little bit of time sharing your experience here at EOU. How's your weekend? How were you enjoying classes? What it's like living here? Feel free to talk about other topics or issues too as they come up. And what I would like you to do is, as you're listening to your partner talk, I would like you to write down what you notice as common words or phrases that your partner is saying, right? So take note of those on a separate sheet of paper or type those. I will be asking you to turn that in later as part of your attendance. So take some time to chat with somebody. You can also chat in a group of 3. Reflect a little bit and take some notes about what you're noticing.
Yeah, brother Lakeside in my group. Yeah.
Yeah, so you'll hang on to it for now, but 1 sheet per person. Yeah, since you're noting your partner.
Yeah.
Taking a couple more minutes. So go ahead and wrap up your conversation, return back to your seats and hang on to that sheet of paper for now.
Yeah, because we are still very. Yeah.
Great. So I hope you enjoyed catching up. I know that there was a football game in Montana last weekend, and people have been doing some travel for athletics, extracurriculars, all that fun stuff. So do continue to hang on to that sheet of paper. I'll ask you to return back to it in a little bit. And what I'm asking you to think about and reflect on is the role of language that we see from other people. Because oftentimes, right, we'll use filler language, words such as like or without even thinking about it or knowing that we do it. Also, sometimes there are particular words that we like to use in everyday conversation that we never realize that we use really often. I'm sure probably over the course of hearing me for the past couple of weeks, there are things that I say regularly that you've come to notice as well. One kind of interesting example, I was talking to a friend, and in casual conversation, I said, well, I think that's a little bit cavalier. And then I noticed 2 or 3 times in further conversations, my friend had never used the word cavalier, and she started using it in everyday conversation. So our language is shaped by mirroring communication with other people. We start to use similar language to other people the more that we talk to them. So some of those habits and tics kind of develop over time. So this connects to the idea of verbal communication. So verbal communication is a big part of what we do, especially as we communicate online and use things such as texting, sending emojis, and so on, right? Verbal communication is about how we use language or other symbols to communicate. If you think back, right, communication is about how we use symbols to convey meaning. So an example of verbal communication would be the word pi, right? Whether it's P-I or P-I-E, this connection of little squigglies that makes words would be used to communicate either 3.14159, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? It is such a massive number and goes on, and people do contests of memorizing how long the decimals in pi go, that we simplify it with either the word pi or with the symbol here on the right. Some of you who might have taken like geometry or algebra are seeing this and they're like, oh no, not pi again. So this is an example of verbal communication, right? Either the letters pi or even this visual symbol of pi would be considered to be verbal communication because it's using that symbol. Sending a text, verbal communication. How many people say yes? How many people say no? So it would be considered verbal communication because verbal communication can be both spoken and written. Verbal communication includes sending a message or sending an email, right? The deciding factor in what makes something verbal communication is whether or not it's using language as part of the communication process, right? So verbal communication is what you say. Is smiling at somebody verbal communication? How many people say yes? How many people say no? No, smiling is not considered verbal communication because a gesture, right, nodding, smiling, squinting your eyes, right, that would be what's considered to be nonverbal. And we'll be talking more about elements of nonverbal communication as the week continues. What about American Sign Language, also known as ASL? Would that be considered verbal communication? How many people say yes? How many people say no? So yes, ASL, right, is using symbols to convey meaning, right? So letters such as A, S, and L are used here in order to communicate and convey elements of meaning to other people. One kind of interesting thing to know is that ASL actually has accents in different ways that depending on things like age, your own cultural background, etc., that something might be communicated differently. In fact, I wanted to share a short clip that goes over some of the interesting ways that there are actually what can be considered to be accents in ASL. So I thought that's kind of interesting that while verbal communication is the act of doing sign language, how that message is sent, for example, signing very quickly or taking a longer time to do some of the signs would be considered the nonverbal elements of that communication, right? Verbal is what you say or how you communicate. Nonverbal is how you say it. So in addition to that, we have what are known as rules of language. So there's a book that came out a few years ago about grammar, and the book is called Eats, Shoots, and Leaves. I think this is pretty funny and clever. The idea is that a panda walks into a bar, right? The panda eats, shoots, and leaves. So, right, if we were to interpret that without commas, then yes, the panda eats, shoots, and leaves. That's what it eats in its natural habitat, right? It is an herbivorous creature that really enjoys those plants. However, if we say that the panda eats, comma, shoots, comma, and leaves, then we imagine that the panda is suddenly, doing like a John Wick thing, or, is, a next secret agent or whatever, which sounds like the next like CGI kids movie from DreamWorks or whatever. But that's not what we would imagine a panda doing. The reason we know that a panda is not going to eat, shoot, and leave a bar, right, is because of the use of commas in that sentence not being there, and also due to the context and information we have about pandas. An example used in the book is let's eat, comma, grandma versus let's eat grandma, right? The presence of commas to separate out the parts of sentences is crucially important. So, we're not Jeffrey Dahmer and grandma. So the rules of language help to understand and break down how we relate to other people, right? First, we have what's known as semantic, right? So semantic is referring to the dictionary definition of the word. In this case, right, the dictionary definition that we're using is going to be determined by the situation. So in other words, if you were to say, I want pie, right? Probably you're referring to the food. You're probably not saying, I really want 3.14159, etc., because that's probably not very sensical in a sentence, unless you're doing homework, right? And you're trying to solve a math problem and you're saying to a friend, I need pie, so that they can recite back to you what pie is to help solve an equation, right? So the dictionary definition that you're using in your language is dependent on the situation. Pie versus pie, shoots, right, referring to the plant, or shoots referring to shooting a gun, are things that we're applying to a sentence based on context. Syntactic is how we use words, right? So when we think about grammar structure and punctuation, we're thinking about how syntactic rules help us to understand sentences. Again, if we say eats, shoots, and leaves without commas, punctuation, right? They eat, shoots, rather than they eat, comma, shoots, and leave. And then pragmatic, right? Pragmatic is about how we use words in a way that's appropriate or makes sense to the situation. So, for instance, if I'm reading a paper and the paper says, let's eat grandma, right? I am going to assume that the person probably doesn't want to actually eat their grandmother, but because of maybe a misspelling or miscomma or something like that, they just forgot to include the comma there, and that's a mistake, right? I'm not going to assume that you eat your grandparent if you say that in a paper, because I think you're probably a decent person who wouldn't do that. So that's an example of how we use a pragmatic rule to understand and make sense of words and make sure that our words fit in the sentences that we're using. So we use those rules all the time to make sense of and try to understand the language choices that other people are using. Pretty straightforward, but I think differentiating the three altogether helps us to see how we do it. So another key idea here is this way that words shape reality. This is an idea I brought up before, but words reflect our attitudes and words help us to understand ourselves. There's a really interesting example that's used in this week's reading that talks about how in Japan, there's no word to describe a backyard. And if we think about countries like Japan that have higher population density, right? In a lot of those countries, people don't have backyards. That's just not something people do based on the space and proximity to other people. So that is a new concept. It doesn't really have an equivalent when you're translating. That's an issue a lot of translators have between languages, is there are some words that don't carry over. There's kind of a fun trend where there is oftentimes a German word to describe a particular experience or feeling, right? An example is Schadenfreude, which is the feeling of joy that you have in the suffering of others. So if you are a sociopath, right, you might be somebody who appreciates Schadenfreude, right? That would be an example of words that shape reality, but don't necessarily easily translate. An example that I brought up last week is the Piraha indigenous people along the Amazon River. And these people are considered to be anumeric. That is, they do not have words to describe large amounts of numbers. I wanted to share a short clip that actually goes over some of these elements and the ways that language reflect and change some elements of this culture.
Everett began to realize something was missing. The Piraha have no words for commas, no tense or future tense. And incredibly, the Piraha have no numbers. Research.
So a little, a lot, a pile, right? Again, reflects the ways that different cultures understand numbers differently. When interviewed, a mother was saying that while she couldn't necessarily identify a number of kids that she had, she loved and respected each of her children individually and together, right? So how we convey thoughts and feelings through language, how language help us to understand things, right? It's very different across cultures and contexts. We also have what is known as the abstraction ladder, right? So when we use language, we're using language in a way that is either general or specific depending on the situation and context. So say, for instance, you're talking with a friend and you're talking about classes that you're taking. You might say to your friend, I'm taking a class on information, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? That's incredibly vague, doesn't really provide a whole lot of detail. You'll probably get a lot more concrete because you're identifying a specific class that you're taking. I am taking interpersonal communication. It could be a little bit more general and say, I'm just taking a class in communication studies, right? Or I'm taking a class in humanities if you're talking to somebody who's involved in a different college. Like STEM or education. So the level of abstraction you're using is depending on the situation, how precise you want to be to that person, and so on, right? So oftentimes we're not going to be incredibly concrete or precise in every situation, right? You're not going to say to somebody, well, in my COG 111-001 interpersonal communication course with Dr. Benjamin Mann, we talked today about abstraction, right? That would be incredibly verbose and not very efficient. You might probably say something like, in my communication class today, we talked about a ladder and then made a weird joke about Jeffrey Dahmer, right? So the abstraction that we choose to use is going to be depending on that situation, depending on how efficiently we can communicate. If we think about our communication, we're balancing out communicating in a way that's brief, to the point, and says what we need to say, while also making sure that the other person has the information that they need. In fact, as we communicate more and more with people, there's a chance that our communication will become more and more abstract, right? How was your job interview for the new nonprofit that you were working at in Eastern Oregon versus how was the interview? So abstraction is something that we use to make our communication more efficient, but also to convey specificity when we need to. So we also have to consider what words are designed to do, right? So we use language, we use words to fulfill a variety of different functions and goals. One of these distinctions is, and if you've taken a class in English, right, you're probably very familiar with the idea of denotative versus connotative. If somebody went on a date and said their blind date was a weasel, right? We know that that's a term of art that might be used to describe somebody who is dishonest, who is untrustworthy, so on, right? And we know based on the sentence that that's what they're saying. A denotative or literal meaning would say, oh, a weasel, right? The animal. So the denotative is literal, the connotative is the association that we give depending on context, right? So again, the use of slang terminology to describe that is an example of differences in denotative and connotative meaning. If you're saying that a song slaps, right, the song does not have an appendage that it's hitting you with, you're just saying that the song is really good. Depending on how you're using the word daddy in a sentence, might not actually be your father. No judging. So the goals of words, right, are fulfilling different functions. So words can be used for instrumental function. Hey, I need a glass of water. I need to go to the bathroom, right? Or what's known as a regulatory or relational function, right? So sometimes we use words to help to manage and support ourselves in our relationships. Hey, are you doing okay? Would be an example of a regulatory function, right? Think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We communicate in order to fulfill instrumental tasks and needs. I need water, right? We might focus on our relationships and belonging once we've got those things. We also might use words for personal functions or reasons. A good example of this is when you're gearing up for something like an interview. You might choose to rehearse your responses to yourself in the mirror. There's what's known as a heuristic function, right? Which is a function that allows you to learn, right? So heuristics is the way that we make our communication efficient or make sense to us using a shorthand or code. Oftentimes, right, using an acronym or abbreviation helps us as a heuristic function. If you're familiar with PEMDAS in math, right, that gives you an order of how you solve an equation, starting with parentheses, the P. The example I gave of cognitive, helping you to think about cogs in your brain, would be an example of a heuristic function as well. And then a representational function is about how we might request or use information. So for instance, if you took an online class or class over Zoom and your professor started talking muted and they didn't realize they were muted and they went on for like a half hour muted, you might use the chat feature and say, hey, unmute yourself so that I can hear what you're saying, right? That would be an example of a representational function where you're requesting that information, which might be a true story for someone. And as soon as I said that, subconsciously checked to make sure that I was not muted. There's also what's known as this idea of muted group theory. So if we abide by the idea that language shapes reality, right, and the way that we think about something shapes the way that we respond and engage with the world, right, it follows that who has created language, and how language is being used as something that's dynamic and ever-changing is not going to be equal for everybody, right? And so we can have a lot of debate, discussion about the language choices that we use and why we choose to use them. In fact, I am sure if you've been on the internet, there's a lot of discussion about language choices, why we make language choices that we do. But the key takeaway here is this idea that dominant or larger or more powerful groups in society have historically had the ability to define and establish language, right? We've seen this in the context of colonization, where colonizers and countries, right, have the power to dictate language that's spoken and what is considered to be the dominant or correct language of that group. What that means, though, is that we would have what's considered to be a muted group, or a group that is not a part of that larger and dominated culture, who has greater difficulty being heard, understood, and able to communicate their perspective, right? If language shapes reality and dominant groups have ability to shape language, it so follows that our ability to even conceive of reality or to speak about issues is made more difficult if we do not have a role in the creation of language. For instance, language that could be gendered, racist, or sexist are examples of language that might fit in those categories. Again, I'm sure you can think of a lot of different examples of where this might fall. But I want to use an example that ties itself to Indigenous issues. So one thing in the process of colonization, right, in the United States, was this discussion about land, right, and the idea that Indigenous populations occupy used land. However, right, a lot of British colonizers discussed land as a commodity. How much land do you own? What property do you have of land, et cetera, right? Land was conceived of as a thing that people had or had possession of, right? We talk about this a lot when we talk about the right to private property, et cetera. However, for a lot of Indigenous tribes and groups, land wasn't thought about as a commodity. It wasn't thought about as a thing that somebody owned. So the ability to negotiate or discuss who owns what land or what land is occupied by which group was not something that was understood mutually, right? A more dominant group had the ability to say, we own land or we have land, and what would be considered a muted group would say, well, land is not a thing to have or own, it is a thing that exists, and a thing that people live in and around, right? So the idea of how we think about land as a thing that somebody can own or as a thing that cannot be owned, right, is a difference shaped by communication. So what we also have here are examples of different types of language that we might choose to use, right? So a lot of these types can be used to help shape our own experiences and shape, depending on the context or situation, language choices that we might make with other people. One of the biggest examples here is the use of formal or more academic language, right, versus the use of informal language. There's a good chance that how you choose to communicate when you're writing a paper and the language choices that you make are very different than when you're texting or messaging a friend. In fact, there's what's known as code switching, the idea that we switch our language or our way of communicating depending upon the context and situation. So if we're talking to a grandparent, right, and we're being very polite, very formal, versus talking to a friend, might be a lot less formal and more open, assuming that grandma didn't get eaten. Jargon, right, is the use of specialized and technical language. If you have ever seen a show like Star Trek, right, they use a lot of technobabble. If they start talk about ignition engaged, going into warp 7, thrusters engaged, right? Like they use a lot of very technical language to describe what it is that the starship is doing, right? That'd be an example of jargon. Or if you're involved in a job or a field, right, or major that involves the use of a lot of tech, that would be an example of jargon. Or if you're involved in sports or an activity on campus, there's a good chance that it uses a lot of specialized and technical language. Again, I was involved in debate, and we had a lot of very specialized and technical language too. Topicality, counterplan, a priori, net benefits, those were language choices that we made that outside groups will probably not know very well. Also, debate gets very, very fast. People speak in very quick and technical ways to try to get as many arguments as they can out in the time that an example of how jargon might make our communication inaccessible to an outsider, right? The use of colloquialisms is the use of phrases and expressions. And oftentimes, right, those don't easily translate between cultures and groups. But these expressions are designed to communicate issues in a way that makes sense to the group. So for instance, whenever he wanted to leave, my dad always liked to say, let's make like frog eyes and bug out of here, which is very silly and doesn't make sense to an outsider, right? But as an example of a colloquialism. Or the use of having a field day, right? I'm not asking you to actually go out and like put on a jersey and play capture the flag, right? I'm saying that you should enjoy yourself, should have time to yourself. That would be an example of that expression to use. There's a good chance that there are certain phrases and expressions that you're not familiar with and might be lost on you, for instance, generation. Slang, right? So one of the things that I think is really cool and interesting about language is that it's always changing, right? The use of slang is the use of language that's specific to groups and to cultures. Again, Gen Z has increasingly integrated their own slang expressions and so on into their language. Again, saying things like a song slaps would be an example of using slang to describe an issue. Idioms, right, would involve using expressions and figures of speech. So that, again, might involve saying, I'm flabbergasted to describe your response to an issue. Biased language, right, is language that is used for or against specific groups. Again, biased language is language that is not considered necessarily neutral. So, for instance, the word chair, oftentimes in the past, the use was chairman, right? And we would say the chairman of this group is X. But the language that's used a lot more commonly is chair, because that is gender neutral. And we have a lot of chairs who are women, right? So saying chairman Amanda would be a bit odd in its language choices. We also have what's known as ambiguous language. Ambiguous language might be intentionally or unintentionally unclear, right? You ever want to see an example of ambiguous language? Watch a White House press secretary at a press conference, right? Oftentimes, press secretaries are forced to be ambiguous because they don't want to make waves or make a declarative statement on an issue that they might regret or might go against the ideas that they're saying. So saying, for instance, I'll get back to you about that might be being intentionally ambiguous in your responses. And then we have a euphemism, right? So a euphemism is when you are intentionally taking something and making it more abstract. You're going up the abstraction ladder. You're intentionally making your communication less clear, oftentimes because it's seen as inappropriate to be as clear and concrete as possible in your communication choices, right? So one example that I'll give you is from TikTok, right? So a lot of the algorithms on TikTok are designed to like flag things that might be considered outside of the terms of service. So for instance, saying the use of dying or using the word suicide raises a flag, and there's a good chance that your video is going to get taken down. You might get banned for using it. So the common euphemism, and some of you might know this, is a lot of people on TikTok say that somebody unlived, right? And that's being used as a euphemism and stand in to get past the algorithms, to be less clear. We have a lot of euphemisms to describe death, right? Somebody passed away, somebody crossed over, somebody moved on, right? Oftentimes because, depending on the culture and situation, saying that somebody died would be considered a little bit too on the nose. So we use euphemisms oftentimes to manage our communication and fulfill some of our needs. So what I want you to do now is to take a look at that sheet of paper that you worked on to identify the communication with your partner, the words that stood out in the conversation with your partner. right? And as you're looking through this, I want you to classify the types of language that were used by your partner. So you might, for instance, think, well, here they used slang, here they used formal language, here they used a colloquialism, right? So you might think about how they made specific language choices. So take some time to classify the words that your partner used based on these different categories. So zipping up backpacks is a nonverbal form of communication that conveys to me that many of you are done or just about done with this. So if you're still working, you're welcome to continue to wrap up here. But knowing and being able to categorize these different types of language is a really helpful way that we can make sense of how we communicate every day. So to wrap up for today, we talked about verbal communication, right? How we use language to share and convey information to other people, using symbols and using direct words, right? Verbal language, of course, relates to culture and context through examples like muted group theory, and also that ambiguities in communication, the usage of things like euphemisms is meant to try to regulate and control our communication, but sometimes it can be unintended, right? It's not a one-to-one. And as we've talked about in the communication model, right, there's the presence of noise and distortion that can impact what we say versus what somebody hears. So we'll be looking at nonverbal communication for Wednesday's class and getting into some of those elements in a little bit more detail. Once you have completed your attendance activity for today, please make sure your name is on it and pass it forward. Otherwise, have a great rest of your Monday. I'll see you next class.
I gotta take a picture of that.